So, in our time together, the conversation that we're going to have, and the title there is in front of you, Confronting Culture for the Sake of the Gospel. And part of my objective here is to kind of hopefully reframe some things. We all, I'm going to assume some knowledge in the room that we've all kind of been paying attention a little bit to what's going on in the world, and it's not getting any more sane than it was a couple weeks ago. And so we understand the trouble. And we also understand that the gospel is ultimately the solution to the trouble. We, as ministers, feel pulled in a lot of different directions. We don't want to co-opt the gospel for political purposes, but we also want to be the hands and feet of Jesus. We want to be able to cast down every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. So how do we do these things? The first point I want to make here is that we are in a religious war. And I don't mean that we are crusaders, but I think it's helpful to see the dynamics of the conflicts that we are in, and we're seeing very tangible evidence of this right now out of Israel, right? Where the black and white nature of this, the mask is coming off, and we'll talk about some of that. But we are very tempted, and certainly the conversations on social media tempt us to look at all of this in terms of red and blue, conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican, however we want to categorize these things. And today I hope we're going to embrace some more biblical categories. And the evidence is, and I think that it's helpful for us to see this not as a political war, but really as a religious war with competing secular and theistic religions. But these religious wars are really defined by different worldviews. What do I mean? And I want to describe what that is a little bit, because I think this room is going to have a good sense of what a worldview is, but I think it's going to be helpful to describe it anyway, just as a way of giving background. Now, this dilemma here, this debate that these gentlemen are having on the screen, is it a 6 or a 9? How do we resolve this dispute? Now, a lot of people would say, well, we can get them on the same page if we get them on the same side. They're looking at it from the same perspective, and so they might agree on what it is. But of course, we know as a matter of logic that just because two people agree about something does not mean they're correct. Now, it might be peace in the moment, but it doesn't mean that they're right. So we as believers are trying to figure out what the truth of any matter is. How do we find the truth of this matter? And before we try to resolve this, I want to describe and define what worldview is. And this isn't the only one that's helpful. It's one that I use and I find helpful, so I'll commend it to you this morning. Define worldview as our assumptions about origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. But in America, there's a lot of people in recent decades who are walking away from Jesus. And let's go through some of the data. People identifying as Christians have decreased from 90% of the population in 1972 to 64% of the population in 2020. Now, I'm one who is going to assume that you go back to 1972 and you have 90% of the population identifying as Christians. You have a lot of people there who probably weren't actually Christians. It was just culturally safe to do so and popular, and so they identified as Christians. So I'm not sure how much of this is actual theological change and how much of it is just like the cultural winds have shifted, so people no longer feel any kind of obligation to identify as Christians. I think some of this is probably explained by that, because I think we're seeing a separation of the wheat from the chaff. But there's no doubt that there has been a drift. In the last decade, the number of Christians, again, self-identifying Christians, in just the last 10 years has declined 12% from 77% of the population to 65% of the population. The total number of professing Christians has declined from 176 million people in 2009 to 167 million in 2019, even as the population increased by 23 million people. So, breaking this down kind of denominationally, the number of Protestants has declined 15%. The number of Catholics has declined 12%. The nuns grew 70% from 12% of the population to 17% of the population in 2019. Now, the nuns category is those who claim no religion at all. And you're probably familiar with that. So the bottom line is, in America, over the last 10 years, there's an additional 30 million people who now claim no religious faith. And of those, 78% grew up in the church. 78% of the nuns today grew up in the church, which means we're having a challenge transmitting the faith from one generation to another. Now, in just the last couple of days, I've read some really interesting research connecting that to the breakdown of the family, and of men in the church in particular. 80% of men in the church were raised in a home with a continuously married mother and father. 80%. And so as family structure breaks down, you're just losing the men, therefore you're losing the families. So I can be a Chinese woman.
You... Sure.
But I can't be a 6'5" Chinese woman.
Yes.
If you thoroughly debated me or explained why you felt that you were 6'5", I feel like I would be very open to saying that you were 6'5", or Chinese, or a woman.
It shouldn't be hard to tell a 5'9" white guy that he's not a 6'5" Chinese woman. But clearly it is. Why? What does that say about our culture? And what does that say about our ability to answer the questions that actually are difficult? We read 2 Corinthians 10 earlier. That the gospel requires the destruction of false gods, idols, and ideas. That's what it means to tear down every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. When Satan enters the conversation and says, did God really say? We as the ambassadors for Christ, called to reconcile the world to God, we get to say, yes, that's exactly what God said. And not only is it good news, it's the only way for you to be happy. That is the actual path to happiness. Because the common ground we have is everybody kind of wants the same things for ourselves and our neighbors. We want people to experience peace and belonging and joy and commitment, the things that God placed in our hearts. Where we differ is what is the path to that. And so when the question is asked, did God really say? We have to say yes, in the pursuit of tearing down the idols that are keeping people from the gospel. Because what we're being encouraged to do is just hold the door for them on their way to hell, and they'll say, gosh, you were nice to me. Thank you for that. Thank you for not disturbing my psychological safety on my way to hell. Now, the reality is, for us as the church, in the context that these lies are being brought in, is that if you destroy cultural idols for the sake of the gospel, people will describe that behavior as political. That's the reality of the world that we live in. And why is that? Because politics is a Trojan horse. All of this stuff that is debated on MSNBC and Fox News and CNN and all of those things. That Satan, probably in his craftiness, because he's had a lot of time to think about this, right? He said, how do we get the church to be silent and to do nothing if we import all these lies into the culture? Well, why don't we brand them as political? Because they don't want to get involved in that stuff. So if we create this Trojan horse of politics, bring in all of these demonic lies that will make sure people will spend eternity with me rather than with their creator, we can get them to kind of pretend it's not happening. Because saying those things is going to create conflicts. And it will.